This is our fourth Guerrilla Talk of the afternoon, and I'm joined by Sumakshi Singh, who's an artist from New Delhi, whose work is here on the third floor at 320, which is, the work is, I'll just briefly say that it's a painted installation that you walk through, and then there's a video camera set up, and it's recording you in real time, and the vantage point of the camera creates the picture of a artist studio, and you, as the visitor to the booth, are inserted into the scene that the painter is working on, which immediately reminded me of some famous paintings from art history, kind of Las Meninas style. But maybe I'll let you talk about where this installation, the idea for this installation came from. And
I think it came from several things simultaneously. Art history probably being one of the later ones. But I think the first thing that happened was a personal situation where I lost 3 people that I was really close to in the span of 2 years. And it left me, wondering what was real, what lasted, what was permanent, what was fixed. Especially walking through spaces that I was really familiar with, that these people had owned. And finding that I had to renegotiate my relationships to all these familiar objects suddenly, once they'd gone. And I somehow wanted to, create that little rupture between your perception of what you're looking at and the knowledge of what it was for viewers in some sense. So that was one, idea. So it was based on loss in some senses. Another was I started meditating at about that point, and I got really interested in, the yogic notion of Maya that basically says, all of the material world is an illusory construct that, we give reality to through the mediation of our minds or the allocation of our energy by continually feeding in, treating them as if they were real and situations as if they were real. And that there wasn't actually division between forms and matter the way we perceive them. So I think all these things were playing in at the back of my mind when this started.
Is this this kind of interactive installation, is this a new part of your practice?
It is a new part of my practice, yes.
How would you characterize, the works of yours that I know are primarily on paper and paintings, but maybe I'll just let you describe what you were doing before and then...
Sure. So I was trained as a painter, but I haven't... I don't spend a lot of time painting anymore. What I do is I've been creating these site-specific installations at various spaces. I was living in Chicago for a while, teaching there at the Art Institute. And, part of the nature of the city of Chicago is that it's incredibly manicured and super manipulated, and all the trees are the same shape, and the tulips are planted in full bloom. And I started doing these little micro-interventions in the floor, wall, ceiling that started to echo this kind of parasitic activity or weeds in the sidewalk or things that were uninvited and might happen by accident into the cultural spaces themselves. And what started happening with the work is because it was so tiny, every little lump, bump, mark on the wall started looking like it was part of the work. And I was playing with that a lot as well. And in a sense, the quote-unquote pieces themselves almost became decoys for what was actually happening was that people were spending more time looking at the spaces in between them than the pieces themselves or things outside the gallery, where it became really hard for them to switch off this way of looking. And I'd get calls saying, there's this hole in the wall with fungus in it at the subway stop, is this yours? What I realized was happening was that there was a sort of de-bracketing of visual attention that was going on that to me started getting more and more interesting because I felt that the urban environment we were living in Chicago, I felt in a lot of ways that things had been reduced to sort of one-liners where your first quick interpretation was enough, and it was, this sort of immediately gratifying, let's take it and move on situation. And I was wondering, and so in this context, to have this sort of reevaluation, reinterpretation, looking back at your own familiar visual landscape, trying to, unravel further nuances within what was already a given. So it's not so much an invention as something that already exists. It's just shifting the peripheral to the center. And I started wondering if this sort of breaking of the visual frame could take place within recognizable objects as well. And whether it would be possible to, enter the backstage of the image, so to speak, or the object, or work with that. And that sort of led to these illusion-based pieces as well.
What are some of the other illusion-based pieces?
So one of them that I worked on was, I was telling you earlier I'd lost my grandfather, and we used to go to his house every year, and so we were really familiar with all the objects in the space that never seemed to move even an inch. And he'd always told us stories about where he'd got this from, and Maharajas, and all these exciting adventures. And after he died, it was really strange walking through this space because all these objects that had once been so familiar seemed to change meaning, form, intensity. And what I ended up doing was I recreated the illusion of his living room full of these objects in my studio space in France by mapping them on all the pre-existing objects in the space. So as you enter from the vantage point of the entrance, it looks like you're walking into my grandfather's living room. And the minute you step away from that vantage point and start walking through it, of course, the whole thing starts to splatter and splay and fall apart. And then further as you walk through it, it gets increasingly disconcerting in your direct interaction with the space. But in the mediated version on screen, you see yourself walking through my grandfather's living room, except sometimes through solid-looking objects. And that entire thing was mapped in chalk and pastel. The idea was thinking of it as a three-dimensional mandala, so that it would basically erase and blur with people's movements in space, and I could, have some closure perhaps on that fixed notion of that reality, which is actually so fragile. It works from that one little vantage point in space and time, actually.
So the whole installation was drawn in real space with chalk,
right?
And then what about how did you map the objects onto things? Are they painted onto the walls?
So it's very similar to this, except that it's done on it's done on the floor, on the trash can, on the canvas, So the way the process of the mapping works, which is also something I'm really interested in, is that basically I'm running around in three-dimensional space, following the camera's eye. So the camera is looking through a drawing on glass into the space. And I can see what the camera sees through a projection. And then I'm basically ignoring the three-dimensional nature of the room and running around in space trying to trace out the two-dimensional drawing on every single object in the space.
Right.
So in a way, it becomes about mapping a perception of reality that doesn't necessarily correspond to your own experience of space, and it doesn't correspond to where you are, but you're generating this entire fictional environment based on a completely external vantage point. And of course, there's a lot of metaphors for that. So,
yeah, that's what struck me about the piece that's here is that, in a way, I find it really creepy that the camera is the one. It's because it's not a consciousness. I mean, it's just a visual device.
Mechanical.
Yeah, it's mechanical, and so the whole space is oriented around this, creating a kind of perfect vision for the machine. In which, and then you suddenly see yourself inserted into its world, and then also your world in corrected form, as perceived through the camera. Which I found to be a little disturbing.
I think a part of it is really a reflection of where we are right now. I mean, a lot of us locate ourselves through the mediated more comfortably than we do in our direct perception of things. We're more comfortable with our virtual selves. We prefer texting to actually meeting. There's, we're used to being in multiple spaces at the same time. You're in Skype and Facebook and in your pajamas in the room at the same time. And but there's also this trust put in mediation, which is uncannily becoming an increasing propensity, I think, in our current generations. I've seen fights break out in streets and people running and turning on the television to see what the news reporters have to say about that. Not that anyone trusts the news, but you still go through that. And it's interesting. I'm not sure why that happens, but this is part of it too, is that you're looking to something to order your reality for you. And as you say, that thing has no consciousness. It's also constructed. And so, yes, it's very much about that.
Why did you choose the motif of the artist studio for this particular art fair context, or the gallery booth? Or
so multiple reasons for that. One of it, of course, was the art fair context, where it's very much about the shiny object on display. And I think I wanted to talk a little bit more about the backstage area. So in a sense, it was, I was thinking of it as a gesture of generosity, perhaps, like letting somebody into not just the backstage in terms of the studio where the painting is created, but also the painting itself. So you walk through that, the behind-the-scenes situation before its on-stage performance, though, of course, all that is happening simultaneously here. But in another way, I'm more interested in the making angle of things than what happens to them once they're made. I'm more interested in how ideas come and where they come from, and how much of what's in the image is reflecting the external environment, how much is reflecting the internal environment, what are the dialogues that alter all of that. So this is part of a larger series, which is actually based on 11 psychological characters that are autobiographically based. So this first one is based on habit, pattern, repetition, the subconscious. So looking at where the image always reflects the external, and within that is the image of the image, and so on and so forth, as an infinity loop. And these are actually based off characters in the Bhagavad Gita, the Hindu scripture. So this one is based on Drona, who represents habit, and he's the teacher of both the positive and the negative sides. And ultimately, once these 11 characters develop in their different stage sets, they'll all interact with each other, and there'll be various conflicts and resolutions within the playing field of Maya, quote unquote. And so this is character number one that's been introduced, and we'll see what happens to him.
Does that mean that the artist is the creature of the habit and repetition?
In some senses, yes, but I mean, not in all. So that's part of what the conflict and resolution is about, is at what point does habit and the subconscious kick in the making of the image, and then what are the dialogues one has with themselves or with the painting or with the environment that actually, prevents that from happening, or encourages that to happen, or pushes you away from it. And so, of course, all of that is part of the conflict resolution that will happen. So this is just like Act 1, Scene 1.
But as an artist, at a certain point, did you feel like you were in certain habits, or like that there was a kind of repetition in your own work before this?
No, it
new
wasn't.
venture?
It wasn't so much that. It was just.
Sorry, I'm
frankly,
psychoanalyzing.
No. It was frankly walking through museums, galleries, art fairs, and just feeling like a lot of what I saw just felt subconscious. It felt habit-based, repetitive, pattern-based, familiar, over and over. And I was wondering what that impulse is. And I started talking with various artists about it and questioning this idea. And I've basically been collecting all these interviews and basing it off stories, seeing how much of that is true for me, how much isn't, but no.
Well, I look forward to seeing more incarnations of this project. Where else are we going to see them as they unfold?
So at the UCCA,
Okay.
though that's going to be a slightly different looking project,
Mhm.
but in June for the Indian Highway Show. And then at Exhibit 320 in January. And I'm doing a project with Black and White Gallery in New York. And yeah, let's see.
Good luck. I'm looking forward to seeing them.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.